Right, Russia holding war games with Venezuela. Last time I checked, that's right in our neck of the woods, isn't it? Let's get the latest from Jennifer Griffin at the Pentagon. Jennifer, what's going on here?
Hi, Neil. Well, the Russian military is not only expanding into Ukraine this year, it is now boldly carrying out war games, as you mentioned, right on the doorstep of the United States. This year, Venezuela is hosting these war games, which started last Monday and have been an annual event since Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. This is the first time a country in the Western Hemisphere has hosted the games, another example of how Russia, in a race with China, is increasing its influence in Latin America.
These military exercises serve as often a pretext for the pre-positioning of military assets. And I think this could end up becoming a very dangerous precedent to have advanced military operations of some of the biggest adversaries that the United States has only miles away from our borders.
The games include tanks, artillery, and amphibious operations. Some describe it as the military version of the Olympics. Over 7,000 Russian troops will take part in the games, which include shooting competitions. Other competitors include China, Iran, Brazil, and Indonesia. Russian President Vladimir Putin opened the 7th International Army Games at Moscow's Patriot Park Monday. Putin, who has had more than 70,000 Russian soldiers killed or injured since they invaded Ukraine, said Russia's armed forces are, quote, actively being upgraded, and applauded the country's nuclear capacity.
The fact that Venezuela is willing to host these games in which Russia as well as Iran and China are invited is one more way that Russia wants to show the world that despite the sanctions by NATO and the U.S. and others, that Russia is not isolated.
What's really shocking, Neil, is that Russia even has 7,000 soldiers to send to these games, given the losses in Ukraine and how stretched the army is. The only NATO member to participate in these games was Greece. The U.S. observed them 1 year, but did not actively take part this time. Next week, Chinese troops will travel to Russia to take part in a separate joint military exercise hosted by Russia, which also will include India, Belarus, Mongolia, and Tajikistan.
Russia holds war games in Venezuela, sending alarming signals throughout Latin America. Joseph, I begin with you because you gave me very careful presentation that this was going to happen. According to the Miami Herald, they're reporting forces from Burma, Belarus, Abkhazia, Uzbekistan, China, India, Pakistan, and Indonesia are participating in what are called competitions. Now, there's a disconnect here. It's called an international war game and called competition. And the remark from Venezuela's defense minister, Vladimir Badrino, says these are nations participating that, quote, daily condemn imperialist aggression against the peoples. Strange language, Joseph. What are these games meant to achieve for Venezuela? It looks very, very unusual. Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. So I guess the official title for these games is the International Army Games. It's something that Russia put together back in 2015, and it's important to kind of get into the context of when they put it together, because they put these games together the year after they annexed Crimea, and the same year, slight months before, that they send their major military contingent to Syria. And so what these games were meant to do from the very beginning were able to project military force, to project military alliances, international alliances on behalf of the Russian Federation worldwide. Now, Venezuela's been a participating member in these games since 2015, but they would hold the games in territories in the near abroad of Russia. They held a lot in Belarus. They held some in Central Asia. They've held them in Iran. And basically, there are a series of competitions, mostly related to special operations, but other kind of, typical military maneuvering, tanks, artillery, things like that. But the difference between this year, 2022, is this is the first time in the history of those games since 2015 that they're holding a competition in Venezuela on the other side of the world. And this was quite a bit of news for many folks in Latin America, specifically for their neighbors in Colombia. then there's a concern with given the context of what we're living today with Russia, with this invasion of Ukraine, with China's threatening of Taiwan and Iran and everything it does. And so now to have the military units, and specifically the snipers and special operations units of those countries coming to Venezuela is a cause for concern. But I'll say exactly why, John, because it's not so much the competitions themselves. I think that's the least part of these games. It's both the precedent that this sets to normalize the routine military deployments in a very overt fashion from Russia, Iran, and China to Latin America. And second, this, I believe, is part of a continuum where they're going to start with these, what Russia calls the War Olympics, but it's going to move to joint naval exercises, joint army exercises, and it's going to normalize this activity in the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere when that's not normal. It's not normal in Latin America or in the Western Hemisphere to have Russia, Iran, and China conducting joint military exercises on this side of the world. So I think that's what this is intended to do. This is the first step.
And the Maduro regime then is growing in strength as the war in Ukraine grinds on. Is that correct? Because it's a puzzle, Joseph, understanding that in the first Cold War, actions such as shaking hands between two presidents who are conducting what the U.S. regards as unacceptable conduct would be alarm bells, but I don't hear them ringing in Washington.
That's a good point, John. I don't see the Biden administration taking this as serious as it should, at least not publicly. Maybe they're doing stuff behind the scenes, but on the public stage, they're not only are they not talking about this really concerning alliance between Russia and Venezuela, but they're not even talking about Venezuela in general. Venezuela hasn't been a point of conversation inside the White House or anything that they've projected in public policy. So a lot of Latin American observers, Latin American analysts have been very confused about the Biden administration's policy on Venezuela, aside from negotiations that they're having on hostage release, which is fine, or attempts to lure the Maduro regime into a negotiation or back into a negotiation in Mexico. There really hasn't been a lot discussed. Meanwhile, this alliance, this the Russia, Venezuela, the Moscow Caracas alliance is getting very strong, and it's something I think the Colombians, maybe not the Colombian government now, but the Colombian citizens have been very concerned about for quite a long time.